Hello and welcome to the Global Wire Conversations. Today I'll be talking to Professor Russell A. Berman. Professor Berman is a professor of the Humanities at Stanford University and senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Professor Berman has written extensively on political Islam, German and European history, and other issues particularly pertaining to the role of the state in the ongoing COVID crisis. In our conversation, we'll touch upon all of these topics. I'm asking you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel or to our platforms where we provide our podcast, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or whatever your favorite platform is. The more subscribers we get, the more quality content like this we can provide you with in the future. Let me start right away with my first question that pertains to some of your writings over the last few months, where you have written extensively on the global pandemic and among other topics. Before that, your main research area was mostly European, particularly German literature and history, as well as the global struggle with political Islam as a political ideology. It seems quite natural for many of us to compartmentalize these fields. We look at the pandemic, we look at other political areas, but I would like to talk with you a little bit about where these areas might overlap. For example, what do you think will be the consequences of the expected global economic downturn for political Islam and its proponents as well as its opponents? And do you think there is a chance or a risk that increased social disparities could lead to a resurgence of Islamism in Muslim majority countries and simultaneously make the integration of Muslims in parts of Europe and even the United States more difficult?
Okay, when are you going to ask me hard questions?
I'll get to those. This is just a warm-up round.
Okay, well, no, that's a lot. First of all, we could spend an hour or more talking about the problem of compartmentalization and disciplinary narrowness. A problem with intellectuals, I believe, is they tend to narrow themselves even more than institutions require. It's a kind of, as they say in German, vorauseilendes Gehorsam. I think universities actually would like faculty to be more interdisciplinary than they tend to be, and that's unfortunate. But I won't belabor that Weberian discussion. I'll just say that in my own case, I began, as you pointed out, thinking of studying, getting a degree, getting a doctorate in German literature. I find that if you work on modern, that is post-18th century Germany, you can't avoid history and politics ultimately. But more importantly, I thought of myself as someone who thinks about Germany, German-speaking Europe, Austria as well, from the vantage point of North America. That is to say, I was part of a larger field of German-American relations. And from there, it's not that big a leap from thinking about literature to thinking about foreign policy, foreign relations, transatlantic relations in general. So in the course of my career, I think I maybe reinvented myself a bit as someone who moved from a exclusively aesthetic field, but aesthetics are never exclusively aesthetic, to one that also thinks about politics and U.S.-European relations. I spent this past year, just before the lockdown, from March to March, as a senior advisor in the State Department on U.S.-European matters. So that's part of an anti-compartmentalization campaign of my own. I also thought a lot about Islamism because initially I was thinking about anti-Americanism in Europe and terrorism in Europe and counterterrorism, and I wrote a book on these topics. And I became more engaged in this thinking about Islam and its encounter with the West. But unlike many who get engaged in this topic from various points of view, Islamophobe and Islamophilic, I decided to bite the bullet, and I've been studying Arabic for the past 4 years. I figured that as a humanist, I should take humanism seriously and learn the language and be able to read the text. So I spent a lot of time understanding that, and I think I've got a deeper insight into the complexity of the Muslim world. we could spend another many hours talking about Islam and Islamism and how they're falsely equated, but how they're also falsely separated. Huh? It's a complex field. Your question specifically was about the current prospects for Islamism, Islamist politics, and the impact of the pandemic. First, the one thing about the pandemic is that the world is suddenly full of experts and none of them know anything. Everybody thinks that they've done it right and the other guy's done it wrong, or the other way around, right? And at the same time. Countries that seem to get it right at first are seeing outbreaks. Countries that seem to be doing poorly initially are doing better. I noticed that I don't know if you saw this piece that I wrote. The impact of COVID in the Muslim world in the Near East has strangely been considerably less than in Europe. This is not a case of the developed world doing well and the underdeveloped world doing poorly. It almost seems as if it's the opposite, although there are exceptions. And my thesis is that we know from the developed world, from Europe and the United States, most of the COVID-related fatalities are among older people. And it is simply the case that in many of the developing countries, that population doesn't exist because the life expectancy is shorter. So the big death rates in the West, if I can put it that way, in the developed world, don't tally up the same way in the Muslim countries of the Middle East because you don't have that many old people. We'll have to see if this holds. Things may change, but the journalism around all of this is terrible. When I read the German press, I note the glee with which they report about the death rate of the United States and how well Germany is doing. Well, yeah, Germany is doing better than the United States, but Germany is doing a whole lot worse than Austria, Hungary, and Poland, countries that the Germans like to beat up on. Turkey is doing a lot better than Germany. This is not reported in the German press, but you can see it at the Johns Hopkins website. Now, what is the impact of all of this on politics in the Islamist world? I don't know. I don't see a resurgence of Islamism in the sense of ISIS, Daesh, Al-Qaeda. You don't need a lot of them to make a big explosion, but I don't see a big popularity rise. If we look at what's happening in Beirut right now, that's not about Islamism at all. There's a big upsurge in political activism in Jordan right now, but not about Islamism. It's about the teachers' union, and it's about honor crime. It's against the Islamists, if anything. Huh? It's against the legislation that allows for lower sentencing if it's an honor crime killing. So there may be some Islamist action if you want to think about Iran as a version of Islamism. Turkey is a mystery. Erdogan represents a version of Islamism, but his popularity seems to be eroding as well. With regard to integration, in the United States, I don't see a problem of Muslim integration. There are some radicals in the university world who like to claim that it's there, but it doesn't exist. Of course, people face discrimination and racism everywhere in the United States too, but there's nothing like the Muslim immigrant ghettos that you have in Paris or in Vienna, for that matter. Right? That does not exist. There's a lower rate of Middle East immigration into the United States. A lot of the Middle East immigration to the United States were people fleeing the Iranian regime. Arabs, Christian Arabs, are a prominent part of the Muslim immigration movement here. Some political scientists claim that part of the Trump victory in Michigan in 2016 had to do with the Christian Arab vote voting for him. The world is complicated. Where there's a problem is in Europe. Where the problem there is that you've had significant waves of immigration, different ones to be sure. Algerians in Paris are not the same as Syrians in Berlin, or Turks in Vienna. They all have different profiles, but they're living, side by side with the relative affluence of Europe, except side by side, that is separated from it, and that's why I think we've seen some violent events. I believe there was an event in Vienna where Turks and Chechens were fighting it out in the streets of Vienna.
Kurds. It was Turks and Kurds.
Turks and Kurds, excuse me, Turks and Kurds, and then there's been these series of youth riots in Germany in which I believe there's a certain amount of immigrant background participants, but not only. So Europe's a special case on all of this. That of course is partially Corona driven because the party scene can't be in the clubs.
I mean, if I might add on a somewhat provocative question to this, is it possible that Islamism in the Middle and Near East is eroding? Because very often when Islamists come to power, they fail to deliver on their promises. Whereas in the European case, if particularly due to the pandemic, let's say the kind of social contract becomes more contested, the economic situation, particularly for the lower economic classes, is worsening, that there then Islamism becomes a much more important part of the minority identity. We saw this a little bit, I mean, it's a tiny empirical fact, but for example, when Turks vote in Austria, approximately 72% vote for Erdogan's party, which shows that actually Austrian Turks seem to be much stronger supporters of Erdogan than Turks living in Turkey. So that maybe Islamism will become potentially much more a phenomenon of Muslims in Europe than it will become a phenomenon of Muslims in Muslim majority countries.
Yeah, I know. I think that's true. I think that was that discrepancy in the Turkish vote between European countries and Turkey held across the board, except I believe in Spain, where the Turkish population is more established and middle class. You're right. If the economic situation continues to weaken due to COVID, then that's going to hit Muslims in most European countries disproportionately. It won't be hitting only Muslims. It'll be a class issue. But because of the prominence of the Muslim population, that could play a role. And precisely that kind of demographic is not significant in the United States. Of course, there are Muslims who are poor, but they tend to become lower middle class, shopkeepers. And if you own a shop, you don't riot, right? You riot if you're an unemployed worker. With regard to the shift in the political orientation, speaking with a colleague in France who talked about how, 4 years ago, the socialists advocated for non-citizen Muslims to be able to vote in local elections. So non-citizens, but primarily it's a Muslim question, because at that point they would have voted socialist. But now, since the expectation is they would vote for the Islamist party, the socialists are against it.
Which is, from a political viewpoint, and somewhat understandable switch in their position.
Sure. Yeah.
mean,
no one ever said politicians have principles.
that is, unfortunately, that seems something that is proven more regularly than one would wish for. I mean, as we just pointed out, the economic conditions do really play a significant role in these political development. But as you also mentioned about yourself, that originally you come from the literature side of the humanities. So I would like to talk a little bit about how ideas and the representation of ideas in literature matters for politics. I'm here particularly referring to your book, and I'm quoting the title, Fiction Sets You Free, Literature, Liberty, and Western Culture, where I think you make a very strong case that Western individualism was not just a consequence of some rational realization of individualism, but it's something that emerged out of ancient literary works and then gradually morphed into the social institutions like liberal democracy and the market economy that I think very often we take for granted or see as, to make a Fukuyama-esque argument, we see it as kind of a natural end state of human societal development. But the question is that really the case, or need there to be certain cultural underpinnings?
Yeah, well, it's clearly not it's clearly not natural. It doesn't have to take place everywhere. There's nothing mandatory or predetermined about it, nor should we be in the business of talking about end states. Fukuyama, most of all, right? History actually hasn't come to an end. But I guess in this context, let me underscore a couple of points regarding my thesis in that book. One is that I make the argument, maybe somewhat conservatively, but so what? That there is something substantive about a Western tradition. This doesn't mean that the values of the West today were always there at the beginning. It doesn't mean that the West always lived up to its values, but that there is something like a substantive tradition that coheres over long periods of time. That is, it's not as if each new generation is born barbarians and has to educate itself. We inherit language, we inherit cultural forms, we inherit cultural institutions, we inherit patterns, we inherit error, we inherit guilt, and you can pretend to step out of it, but you never really do. This doesn't mean that you can't understand other cultures. Of course you can try, but you're coming from your own perspective all the time. And I think it's unfortunate that in our educational institutions in the United States and in Western and in Europe in different ways and variously in different countries, there's a antagonism to a notion of a Western tradition and actually an antagonism to a notion of a national tradition. None of us experience the Western tradition unrefracted through national circumstances. My sense is that in parts of Europe, there's a real reluctance to embrace the notion of national identity for fear of being tarred as some right-wing radical. The way I try to explain this is that in the centers of Western Europe, that is Germany and France, a narrative circulates that the catastrophes of the 20th century were due to excessive nationalism, and therefore one has to stop being national and become European. That's what Germans say. French sort of say it, but don't really mean it. And the Germans don't really mean it either, because although they say it, when push comes to shove, in terms of EU politics, they'll pursue national interest bitterly against the interests of other Europeans. Nonetheless, they'll talk multilateralism. But what I find striking is that when I travel through Central Europe, that is the countries between the Baltics in the north and Bulgaria in the south, countries that lost their national independence for decades of the 20th century, there's not a lot of eagerness to give up national independence. There's not a lot of eagerness to merge merge and dissolve into some genuine, some encompassing European identity. Of course, they want to be part of Europe, but they want to be part of Europe as Latvians or as Poles or as Hungarians. And then they have to work through their own dialectic of local nationality and European common values. All of that pertains to literature, because literature has been, could be, a venue to think through the relationship between local cultural formations and larger cultural formations. It's a repository of history that's available to readers who aren't historical experts. Not everybody wants to spend their time in historical archives, but more people enjoy a narrative. So that's one part of the thesis in my book. The other thesis in the book, that a lot of this has to do with the psychological development associated with the technologies of reading, and the fact that it was in the West that we had the dissemination of an alphabetic writing system first, made writing and reading more accessible more quickly. Of course, there wasn't literacy widespread throughout the Middle Ages. On the contrary, literacy was preserved by the church. But slowly, literacy could disseminate, and with that, a process of democratization could set in.
I mean, would it be fair to say that there's kind of another hidden strength, and you touched upon this a little bit when you talked about narratives, that there is a second strength of literary works as access to values, because potentially it makes them more accessible, because it nests them in this kind of larger narrative structure. I mean, this I think one of the big lessons from almost all large religions is that they provide a significant narrative, right? Whether it's from the Bible to the Quran, it's not just 2 pages of commandments, it's an entire work of a narrative that makes clear, understandable why these commandments are moral, why these rules should be obeyed. So it's much more than just a taxonomy of here's what you do and here's what you don't do. So the reason why I'm asking this is because I'm sometimes wondering, for example, in the Netherlands, they had this idea in integration that when you came to the Netherlands, one of the first things they did is they would show you a picture of a homosexual couple kissing each other. Apparently, in the hope that when people see this, they will immediately say, well, yes, right, this is a form of liberty that's worth embracing. But I'm wondering if the use of particular parts of the Western canon, right, and we could have a separate discussion what that should be, if that wouldn't make these things more accessible, right? If I don't know, giving somebody Cervantes or John Milton or any kind of literature, whether that wouldn't make certain values and ideas more understandable than just showing them a picture of what is kind of the symptom of liberty, but not its root cause.
Yes, I think what's at stake here is, first of all, what kind of cultural integration one wants to undertake vis-a-vis immigrants from other cultures. It'd be absurd to expect immigrants from other cultures in Germany to be obligated to start wearing Bavarian costumes as a precondition of becoming citizens. On the other hand, some familiarity with the big issues in German history and some acceptance of the core cultural claims, I think, should be a precondition. The notion of a Leitkultur, a directive culture, became controversial in Germany. In my understanding, one of the first scholars to use the term was Bassam Tibi, who was actually a Syrian German, taught a long time in the United States as well. And for him, the Deutsche Leitkultur was the Leitkultur of the Bundesrepublik, who was democratic values, right? It wasn't, you have to be able to recite the Glocke. It was, you would have to share the values of the basic law. If the expectation is that citizens obey the law, then they ought to know what the law is. And the law begins with the Grundgesetz, with the basic law. So there should be some expectation of knowledge about and cultural integration into the values of society. Now, doing this as an imperative, as your model of the Dutch, an imperative through a picture, versus engagement with a complicated narrative, I think is exactly right. But it's interesting for another reason. You're contrasting the didactic picture with the grand narrative of a religion. That's where you started, really. Normally, modern secularists denounce religion as a catalog of commandments, when in fact it is the model of the didactic picture is the real authoritarian commandment, while an engagement with a complex set of values, whether in holy text or a complicated novel, would engage readers with the real experience of having to balance different values against each other. I've been involved in a commission thinking about human rights in the United States. And we argued that part of the human rights tradition in the United States derives from the American founding that placed emphasis on religious freedom. Liberal critics of our work have complained about the underscoring of religious freedom. I take the position that unless one has some pre-political, meta-political, could be religious or not, right? It could be philosophical, grounding of rights, then the only thing you're left with is rights as a function of positive law, which means that the only rights you follow are the ones that have been legislated, which means you sort of end up in an Eichmann position of just following the law. You want to have something higher than the law. And if you want to call higher than the law God, that's fine. If you want to call higher than the law the human condition, I'm fine with that too. But we were talking about politicians and principles before. Please let us have rights beyond those unprincipled politicians.
And I think that's right. I think that's really the issue that is described so accurately here, which is also sometimes it seems that I'm exaggerating here slightly, but very often it seems that the secular argument does not fully understand the religious argument, but I feel very often the religious argument understands, for example, the secular argument quite well. And I think part of the kind of struggle that you have alluded to is that and this brings me again back to a little bit the Dutch example, that there is the idea, and also to Bassam TV, which I think is a wonderful example here, that knowing the law is one thing, but I think there is the perception that if we connect it a little bit with the migrant question, if only people that come to Europe would know the laws, they immediately this was an argument that Christopher Hitchens also made, it will fall like scales from their eyes. They will now realize that this is the right way to do it. They will, so to speak, leave their previous culture at the door and fully embrace, based on their rational faculties, this new values, this new kind of culture. And I think the religious or non-purely secular argument says, it's not that easy because people have an emotional attachment to values. They have an emotional attachment to rules. So it's not just that they obey the law because they fear punishment, or they obey the law because it's the rational thing to do. They obey laws because they think they're the right laws. They're moral commandments. And I think this is where Europe, for me, more than the United States, seems to fail a little bit. The United States have, with the Constitution, they have these which, and correct me if I'm overstepping here, but very often the United States like to say that these principles are based on kind of reason and rationality, but they are filled with a lot of emotional content, right? The way, for example, an American citizen talks about the Constitution, you don't see many Germans talk that way about the Grundgesetz. So I think it's easier to get a Swedish or Somali immigrant to the United States to fully embrace, endorse, and identify with the US Constitution than it would be for an Egyptian migrant in Germany to do with the Grundgesetz. And I think Bassam Tibi is almost an exception because he really ended up embracing a German identity, a German Leitkultur, but not just rationally, but also emotionally.
Yeah. I think that's the point, that the successful participation in the political community is not simply a function of being able to know the statutes and how big the fine will be if you drive through a red light. Yep. There has to be more to citizenship than that. One dimension of this more effective realm has to do with religion. And again, religion is not just knowing, being able to cite chapter and verse, but it has to do with some kind of affective involvement with the symbolism and the liturgy, with the narratives. And narratives points to a separate dimension of aesthetic. Here, aesthetic and religion, of course, they're not the same, but they're close to each other in addressing dimensions of human experience that can't be subsumed to fearing the law.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. And since we're already talking a little bit about these cultural and emotional issues, I'd also like to touch a little bit on your writings about European anti-Americanism. I think there was a great title of the book you wrote about it when you write about it. I'm quoting the title, Anti-Americanism in Europe. You describe it as a cultural problem. Do you think that anti-Americanism in Europe has gotten worse since Donald Trump took office? And why is it that Europeans still have to see some difficulties understanding the founding principles of the United States, and that very often this lack of understanding seems to morph into a form of quite thinly veiled hostility towards the United States?
I wrote that book in the wake of 9/11. And one sad conclusion that I really only touched on in the book, it wasn't the central point, is that I think that an anti-Americanism erupted then precisely because the United States was seen to be vulnerable. There's a bad human predisposition to disdain the injured. But leaving that aside, I think that one has to be careful when one talks about Europe, because Europe is a very big space, and the attitudes toward the United States vary significantly from country to country, let alone demographically within countries. I think the most recent survey I saw was a Pew survey, and it showed that anti-Americanism or hostility toward Donald Trump, and those two things are different, but they're close, was highest in Germany of all European countries, except for that one very European country, Turkey. Turkey, it's even worse. But Germany and Turkey are the bottom. There are countries in Europe that have positive attitudes toward the United States, especially in that eastern flank, especially in the countries to the east of Germany. For all of the talk about Donald Trump being somehow in bed with Vladimir Putin, those countries who have reason to fear the Russians are in fact very positive on Donald Trump. Part of this is an effect, I think, of the good speech he gave in Warsaw. But even in parts of further Western Europe, you don't find the abysmal results that you get in Germany. So one reason Germany is particularly low, I believe, is that the United States just defeated Germany in 2 wars, maybe 3 wars if you count the Cold War. Right? Other countries have been allied with the United States, not Germany. I also think that there's been animosity between the leaders of the Federal Republic in the United States since Donald Trump took office. People will remember the charming greetings that Chancellor Merkel sent to Donald Trump when he won the election, and she gave him a kind of backhanded congratulations. We'll be good friends with you if you do this, do that, do this, do that. At first, I thought she sort of stumbled into that, and she irritated the president or the candidate, the newly elected, the president to be, and that things went downhill from there. Now I'm beginning to think that I wonder if she did that intentionally, precisely in order to irritate the relations, because that has only helped her polls in Germany. That it was a kind of strategic move on her part. Germany aside, maybe more generally in Europe, I talk about 3 different components that provide foundations for anti-Americanism. I think since the 16th century, the discovery of the New World unsettled the self-understanding of the Old World. You can see this in old texts. I think that there are stereotypes about the United States that circulate the country of plutocrats, sort of ultra-capitalists. This is particularly strong on the left. But then you also have the country of the chaotic masses, the uneducated, the immigrants who couldn't make it in Europe. They fled to the United States. So there's a kind of disdain upwards and disdain downwards on the part of Europeans. And then finally, I think part of the problem in Europe, but now here more again in Western Europe, is that the United States is very insistent on national sovereignty, on national identity. The official position in much of Western Europe, certainly within the EU, is give up your sovereignty and be run internationally. And I don't. There's very little of that sentiment in the United States, and all that turns into a kind of resentment about the United States.
From your perspective as an outside observer, and what I'm always wondering regarding kind of this, exactly what you said, this European approach of internationalism and transnational and supranational institutions. And I think this is the question I think that Europeans themselves have a hard time answering. Is this really, as many claim, particularly in the European bureaucracy, that this is the way of the future, that this is kind of the way how politics should be conducted in the 21st century and beyond? Or, this would be the more provocative part of the question, or is it kind of almost a symptom of some wrote about civilizational exhaustion, if you will, right? That the kind of the European countries on their own, that, again, I'm exaggerating here, but they are somewhat tired of politics, right? That kind of the European Union is a little bit kind of that finally politics will only become, so to speak, management, right? This is why you have this huge bureaucratic apparatus. The kind of the main goals would be some form of a European welfare state and trade, but in all other, like in the cold, hard power politics, right? Europe does not play a significant role anymore. And very often that seems to be almost voluntarily, because theoretically the economic resources would, for example, certainly be there to be a major military power. But it seems to be a political, ideological, and probably cultural decision to say this is no longer what Europe wants to do, right? We want to focus on ourselves, build as extensive a welfare state as possible, and kind of have good relations with everyone, but don't really dabble too much in other countries' areas.
So what I'll say is it should not be understood as an argument against European countries who are close to each other to cooperate with each other. Having a common market is not necessarily a bad thing. Mm-hmm. But giving up on democratic sovereignty is. I think a key part of that Western tradition we were talking about earlier was the aspiration for self-governance, for people to rule themselves. If not, then we can go back to feudalism. I don't think we're going to find any proponents of that. Therefore, until you're prepared to have genuine Europe-wide elections, you have national sovereignties, and these nations are the repositories of histories, values, and experience. The symbolism of national identity, the cultural values of national identity, the historical knowledge. All of this is nation specific, not Europe specific. If you were only going to have Europe specific and not nation specific, that would mean that the Burgtheater should only be putting on, say, 1 out of every 20 plays by an Austrian playwright, and fill it with Spanish and English and French, Portuguese. Right? All that Schnitzler and Grillparzer, that is just nationalism on your part. I think that that's, of course, a silly argument. Right? Just like I think that the theater in France doesn't have to give up on Racine and Corneille. Right? The Germans, of course, have already given up on Goethe, but that's their problem. The issue is that there are national experiences, and they find their expression in cultural symbols, but also in democratic self-governance. That's not wrong. That democratic self-governance can participate in European cooperation. The issue is how much of that sovereignty are you prepared to cede to Brussels? Right? Some, but maybe not as much as the people in Brussels would like. I don't see that as a reactionary argument. I think that is a pragmatic, democratic argument against bureaucratization. Now, yes, Europe as a whole has the power, has the wealth to be a more powerful actor in the international arena. And if Europe were in fact to do that, one would have to respect that. So far, there's, Merkel has said it, Macron has said it, but nobody's doing anything. And for Europe to do that, it would have to be prepared to dedicate a larger part of its aggregate house budget to defense costs. Which means cutting back on welfare state costs. Make that case in an election. Right? But the precondition for moving in that direction is, as I said before, something like Europe-wide elections, and you just saw that path blocked in the Spitzenkandidat phenomenon. Right? You did, in a sense, have an Europe-wide election, but then that solution was forbidden.
But because I think that particularly the argument about election, I think that's a great argument, because I think there is so much truth to it. But Europe, in some sense, is unique in one sense that I think it is fair, exactly as you pointed out, it is fair to say that there is something like a shared European experience, a kind of one form of a shared European identity. But at the same time, there are differences. I think one example, I forgot who it was, who used it, was saying, nobody in Austria knows who is #1 in the French music charts. Whereas probably, in the United States, somebody from New York, Idaho, and Los Angeles has somewhat of a feeling what's currently, the most played, the most popular song in the United States. And I think there's something to that there is still, even if you would have these Europe-wide elections, that you would have the bureaucracy or the political institutions necessary, but hasn't it been neglected to really try and form a European identity? That there was this hope we overcome nationalism without finding anything to replace it with.
Okay, so my point was not to propose really Europe-wide elections. My point was ad absurdum. the fact that European-wide elections are just unimaginable is because there's so much national particularity. Now, what this means is that the shared European identity is precisely the multiplicity of nations. The shared European identity is like Greek city-states more than it's like the Roman Empire. And that's not a bad model. That's not a bad model. It doesn't prohibit cooperation, but it also preserves particularity.
But I think that's a beautiful way to put it, because I think you're right, exactly. It's more like the league of Greek city-states and this Roman Empire would immediately put a stop to the idea that there ever will be something resembling a United States of Europe in the sense of a large federal state, that this would be exactly what you just said, that this would not just be a bureaucratic political difficulty, it would probably go against the very essence of what it means to be European in the first place.
I agree with that, except that I'd hesitate to say never, because one can't know what's going to happen. Because let me you talked about American culture and the music charts in New York or in Nebraska. Well, of course, the United States is a very mobile population. People in Nebraska may have moved from New York 10 years ago, or vice versa. Yes, there's some mobility in Europe, especially in the professional class, but most people live in the country they're from. The reason why I don't want to say never is the following. I believe it was 1992 or 1993 that was supposed to be the year of Europe, that had long been planned as the year of Europe. But the part of the Yugoslav war broke out. And from an American point of view, the lesson of the Yugoslav war was that after more than 40 years of Europeans saying no more genocide, in fact, the Europeans were powerless facing what was going on. And the Americans had to go in and take the lead in stopping the genocide. I don't want to brag about the American role. My point is that if a European army had gone in and stopped the genocide, had prevented the massacres, had reestablished order, then if you had shared shed blood of Europeans in the service of an ideal that people could embrace, that might have been a step forward toward a European unity. But the fact that they didn't do it was an opportunity that was missed.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to stick to the European topic, but there are two more issues I really want to hear your take on. One is kind of a more contemporary and within academia. And since you are an observer of cultural issues, I'm very curious to hear whether you have an opinion on what's currently happening to campus culture at universities in the United States and what seems to become the ever narrower bounds of public debate. The keyword here would be this idea of cancel culture. Do you think that at some point there will be a conservative backlash, or that we're only witnessing the beginning of academia and media being overtaken by what is very often called the woke culture?
Yeah. Right now it's summer vacation. And we're also in the midst of the COVID crisis, so no one's on campus. And I think that's toning some things down. But the predisposition to police speech and limit debate and vilify heterodox thinkers has become terrible. It's sometimes the way I describe it is some colleagues have been able to reinvent the robotic speech of Communist Party members in an era in which we don't have a Communist Party. We can't blame it on Moscow anymore, right? This is a endogenously generated dictatorship of the privileged. It builds on a kind of radicalism among some students and some non-students that would have to parse all that out. What I find particularly disappointing in all of this is that the leadership of universities, the presidents, the political leaders, of course, Republicans criticize it, but the Democrats have been silent on this largely. That they're not standing up to this kind of variant of a neo-Stalinism, instead, what I've heard from university presidents is basically a spineless falling in line with the demands of woke culture. And as I put it in a piece that will be coming out soon, they sound more like Heidegger in 1934 than they sound like Edgar G. Murrow, 1954, when he attacked Eugene McCarthy. Right? Somebody has to stand up to these professors and students and say, have you no shame? Right? If you can't make your argument, then you lose. Make an argument, but don't try to threaten people.
And this, because you mentioned, I think that you quite nicely mentioned also the kind of the what sometimes seems as communist-like enforcement. In one of your most recent articles, so we can kind of conclude our conversation with one last take on the global pandemic. You wrote, and this was in the title, that the original sin of today's global pandemic is the suppression of freedom of expression in China. And in a world where it seems the freedom of expression, as we just talked about in the United States, but also elsewhere, seems to be more and more in retreat. Could you elaborate a little bit more on this point? And that what's I think also very important, that freedom of expression is not just, or the positive effects of freedom of expression are not just that people can say what they want, that there's actually more to it, that this is morally, but also politically and from other angles, a desirable good.
Okay, so one version of the original sin of this pandemic situation is that heroic Chinese doctors were drawing attention to the virus long before it became public and long before the WHO decided to pretend to announce it. And if this had been caught a week earlier, 2 weeks earlier, a month earlier, maybe it could have been contained to Wuhan. But because of the lack of freedom of speech in China, and no one's going to dispute that, because of the lack of freedom of speech in China, because it's a country run by a communist dictatorship, we're now stuck with these casualties, these deaths, this economic catastrophe around the world. You can lay that all on the doorstep of Xi Jinping and his comrades, and we should be able to say this bluntly. This is in the context of the growing tension between the West and China, certainly between the United States and China, which is an enormous reversal of the politics of the past few decades. And matters with regard to China have only become worse. For those listeners who may think about Islamophobia, well, talk about the Uyghurs. For those who are interested in rule of law, talk about upholding the treaty between China and the United Kingdom with regard to Hong Kong, and now the extradition treaty, and now the elections have been postponed, and we were already seeing a wave of arrests. I just read yesterday about a major editor in Hong Kong being arrested. I think this is very significant, and I'm disappointed that European leadership has not taken a firmer stance on this. When the extradition, when the new law went into effect in Hong Kong, several of the Anglosphere countries canceled their extradition treaties or suspended their extradition treaties pretty immediately. I believe that was early in June. It was not until the postponement of the election, deferred by a year, did Germany decide. That is, Germany has a much higher threshold for being irritated with lack of democracy than other Western countries. That's not the sign of leadership. That's a sign of lack of principle. But of course, there's a wider wave of repression circulating the globe. Restrictions on speech, woke culture is part of it. I'm not suggesting a conspiracy. I'm not suggesting that Xi Jinping is in touch with the leaders of Black Lives Matter, but we don't take freedom as seriously as used to be the case. And I fear that the world will pay the price for that.
I mean, if you forgive me one last question, because I think this is such an important point you're making. It very often seems that the West as such, and this I think pertains to the United States and Europe, to some extent we are caught in like political navel gazing, right? We are so focusing on our own history, on trying, which is in general a good thing, but we are so obsessed with kind of dealing with our own historical burdens and historical sins that what's happening right now contemporarily in some countries is a subterranean discussion. I mean, exactly what you pointed out, that the Uyghurs in Eastern China, this should, given the historical experiences that Europe had, right? I mean, this should, all alarm bells should theoretically go off, but there seems to be neither a particularly strongly voiced reaction nor any kind of even the smallest scale economic repercussions, whether it's the installment of 5G by Chinese companies so Europe is getting more dependent economically in China, which is probably making any kind of protest less likely in the future. And this seems exactly what you say for a continent that claims that one of its founding principles or founding reasons was the experience of Auschwitz and the Holocaust. It seems that they do not really live up to their promise.
Countries should not launder their past. People should think about the consequences of what happened in the past, but people should also think about the achievements, the accomplishments, and one can also think about how to do things better in the future. I'm in general not a big fan of Joschka Fischer, but at that moment of the Yugoslav wars, he confronted the Green Party in Germany and said, "We've always said, nie wieder Krieg, nie wieder Auschwitz, no more war, no more Auschwitz, and here we have to choose, right? We're going to have to go to war to prevent Auschwitz, right? to prevent a massacre of Muslims." Now, I'm not advocating going to war, but I am advocating standing up for values, showing that one has some spine and that there's more to the substance of European or German democracy than building another VW plant in Xinjiang.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly the essence. And it brings us probably a little bit back to the beginning of this conversation, which is that probably the idea, particularly also the experience with China and other areas in the world, this idea that it's only a matter of time until, again, and that like the Dutch vision was that everybody is going to embrace these liberal values once they see it, once they hear of it, that doesn't seem to materialize, because these countries know what's happening in the West. They are very well aware of our political and cultural systems, but it seems that they are quite resistant towards its supposed seductive powers.
Well, I think that was the aspiration with regard to China. And during the Deng era, it was possible to believe that China was moving in that direction. But now you have a president for life. You have genocide in Xinjiang. You have the abrogation of the Hong Kong Treaty. You have a surveillance state and surveillance throughout the world through Huawei. What are Europeans waiting for? They're waiting for the Chinese police to knock on your door at midnight. It's a matter of standing up for any values. And what's irksome I find about the about some of the European leadership is that it tends to moralize toward the United States, but also toward Poland, toward Hungary. But then, if the question of rule of law is China, it won't say a thing. If the question is genocide is China, then let's make a deal. The European countries in China are like the IKEA's contracts with the GDR prisons.
Yep. Well, thank you so much. But we could have probably continued this conversation for another hour. So be prepared. I might get back to you. I would love to do this again at some point in the near future. This was wonderful. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation a lot. Take care.
Thank you. Bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.